I want to thank everybody for coming today. My name is Kate Paisani and I direct Carla, and this is one of the talks in our lunchtime presentation series. Today, we are very excited to have James Mackenzie and Mary Hermes talking about their research. James is a graduate of the MA program in Second Language Education at the University of Minnesota, and he's currently a PhD student at the University of Arizona. And Mary is a professor of Second Language Education at the University of Minnesota. And they're going to be talking about Ojibwe language collaboration on forest walks, considerations for Indigenous language and knowledge development. We will leave the chat on during the talk, and we invite you to use the chat for back channeling, but James and Mary will entertain your questions when they're done with their presentation. So welcome, Mary and James.
Miigwech, thank you all. Yat nolso ya besh bich ahenishle na kaiten na epashichin bilagan da shichedo kin chin edashinale ado James Mackenzie and Shie. Greetings everyone. As thank you Kate for that introduction. As she had mentioned, my name is James Mackenzie and I'm a PhD student in language reading and culture at University of Arizona. I am Dene and I had the privilege of going ahead and studying in Minnesota at University of Minnesota in the curriculum instruction, second language and education master's program, and finished that last year. So thank you all for making time to be with us today.
Ninatam, Buju Nindinawe Maganidug, Wabshkimigwan Nindijnakas Nagignin Dudame. Nindamin Oma Odawa Zaga Eganin, Ushkote Wakoin and Dao, Nungum. I'm Mary Hermes, and yeah, I work at the curriculum instruction department in both second language and culture and the culture and teaching programs. And I also run a nonprofit called Grassroots Indigenous Multimedia. I'm super happy to be here with all of you today.
All right, so I think what we'd like to start off by doing is to acknowledge our team, our amazing research team that we had working on this project. Of course, we had Wabishki Dr. Mary Hermes or Fong, who's the leader of our group here. You can see we got our serious looks here. We're doing research. We got Dr. Mel Engman, who is in the Department of Education at Queen's University in Belfast, and I think she's on the call also. And she's also a graduate of, she's actually a graduate of the PhD program in second language education at University of Minnesota. And then we have Dr. Macy, who's a postdoctoral fellow at University of Minnesota, and then myself. And as I mentioned, I'm a PhD student at University of Arizona.
Okay, I'll quit playing with the pointer now. I find new stuff on here all the time. These are some of the things our team put out this summer. We really met once a week all last year and through the summer. We have 3 articles we put out, and one is out in the Modern Language Journal. We gave a talk on that last year for this series. And the one we're talking about today is the middle one. It's currently under review, Cognition and Instruction. And we have something in WinHack. We also put out a large Spencer grant, which I'm happy to say we are finalists for. So yeah, we're busy. So this talk today is really about love. The work we do is about intergenerational love and interaction between all beings, human and more than human. And I want to ask everyone who's here today, what does it mean to be an accomplice? What does it mean to be accountable to the indigenous land that we are on? What does it mean to decolonize the academy?
So I'll go ahead and just share a brief overview of our presentation for today. This study and the presentation for today are based on similar data, or the data that was used for a previous presentation done for Carla by Fong and Mel Engman, that focused on the idea of language as interlocutor. which had more of an emphasis on how the participation of land can be transcribed and analyzed as part of communication and what its implications may be. Whereas today's presentation will be tied largely to an article that Fong also had recognized there that our team worked on for another publication, and we'll tie in more about pedagogy, second language acquisition, and collaboration especially. So in the presentation today, we'll share about, of course, an introduction to the project of documentation as reclamation, with the data that really led to all of these different papers and such, the theoretical framing that we used, the research questions, the methods that we used. We'll give 3 examples of different videos that we looked at, particularly for this paper and the analysis that was done. And then I'll share a little bit about my reflections as a research assistant that was very appreciative to be funded by Carla to be able to do this work with the team last year. And finally, we'll have some discussion and hopefully some great questions and answers. So.
Yeah, so as James was saying, our funding started with a documentation grant, which was from the Dell grant, it's known as, that is usually about documenting endangered languages. But we also did sort of a second part of that, which is the documentation was our corpus that we then used for our analysis. And the analysis was pretty much on our own, but we do thank Carla for supporting James and also the Grand Challenge Initiative. So the documentation as reclamation was meant to shake the human-centered bias. It was meant to make a place for intergenerational language use on land. We really love the multimodal analysis. I'll never think of language the same way again after doing this. And we really wanted to honor those young people who've learned Ojibwe as a second language and are who proficient enough to just go on a walk and talk about whatever with an elder. So those were some of the things compelling us. I think, am I going to talk about this? Oh, okay. So the other thing that's important is that when you do research as activism, it's not going to stay in a box of a discipline. So we have a very transdisciplinary theoretical framework going on here. Some of the main ideas, as I mentioned before, was to link land as a living being in order to de-link from a colonial notion of language. So language tends to be very much anthropocentric. And we really, as Native people, we think of land as our relatives. So what does that mean to take that deeply into thought and then into practice? So here's some of the people we've read. We especially love Bang and Marin. They've done a lot of work in science education and started doing walks like this that were actually related to the water walks the women do around the bodies of water. And the other side, we've drawn feminism. So the new materialism in Karen Barad is very kind of like intersects with this idea of what's going on in between, not in an individual, but what happens in the in-between space. Context, of course, that's all of social linguistics. I just put up Richard Rhodes because I was at Berkeley last fall, and he said to me, he's a well-known Ojibwe Algonquin linguist, and he said, we've been doing it wrong. Linguists have been getting it wrong for 30 years. We should be documenting interaction, not single speakers. And the idea of multimodal analysis and embodied speech from Charles Goodwin, which was mostly our methods.
So based on those theoretical frameworks, we wondered really how language use emergent from particular lands, right, may result in collective affirmation to arrive at shared meaning making with joint activity. We posited in that framework that language and culture are really co-constituted or mutually co-constituted through the embodied interactions on and with land and more than human interactors. So with that in mind, we put forth these research questions. What do the embodied relationships between human and more than human look like when walking with lands in Ojibwe? What meaning making is possible as bodies work in collaboration with the landscapes? And how does the interaction that unfolds in the everyday walking on lands relate to identity and language reclamation? So now I'll tell you a little bit about the methods that we used, and I tried real hard to get some bubbles in here of us thinking about things collaboratively, as was a request. To begin the walks, to begin the actual, what produced the data for this project, setting the experience in Indigenous or Ojibwe ontological ways was important. So tobacco was placed, was offered by participants, which frames the whole walk as really this idea of we are in relation to the Ojibwe spirits and the spirits of the land. The elder and the bilingual youth that went on these walks, they would go for these short walks in the woods, and they were asked to take a walk and to talk in Ojibwe about what they wanted to along the time that they had together. Each walk really lasted about 15 to 20 minutes. And each of the participants were outfitted. They were wearing these point of view head mount cameras. I'm sure a lot of you have seen, as well as voice recorders. And this was important so that the project could capture not only the spoken language that they were using as they were walking along through the forest, but also the visual cues, the nonverbal engagements that happen not only between the human participants, but also with land. So working after the data was I guess captured through the collection process with the recorders and in the walks themselves, working with an Ojibwe language specialist, the data from the recording devices was transcribed and translated in the sound and video annotation software called Elan that some of you may be familiar with. The team then compared the videos themselves with the transcripts. So it was kind of going back and forth between them to add nonverbal action and the visual points of reference, the attention, things like that were taking place. So really relying a lot on conversation analysis conventions, the team was able to account for these extra linguistic cues, much of which is what you saw also described in a little more detail in the Land as Interlocutor presentation, which I think is recorded if you'd like to look on Carla's website from last year. So when it comes to analysis, and I'm kind of over where the bubble is, and our team thinking on this hard together, through multiple viewings, and I mean multiple viewings, discussions and meetings, the team really conducted collaborative analysis of the video and audio data along with the transcripts. In doing so, we used Goodwin's concept of cooperative, co-operative action to review our data, as it lent well to really kind of bringing together these elements of social action. Things like language, material artifacts, cultural learning, all these different types of things into kind of one analysis. But we didn't limit our analysis just to interaction among the people that were involved. We also focused on land along with the humans as participant in the interactions for our analysis. The team sorted and narrowed the video segments. There's a lot of data and hours of footage, but we had to go through and sort and narrow the different segments based on different things that we saw, the interpretation that we had of thematic organization of the participants' cooperative action, and episodes were identified, which we're going to share with you a few of them here, and then they were analyzed beyond that. So really important to this process, we followed the shifts in attention that you'll see, and I'd ask you to really keep an eye on that as you're watching these videos, and the orientations that take place throughout the whole thing. And finally, as we got to the next stage, we really conducted more micro-interactional analysis as we narrowed those segments related to the themes that had been identified by the team. So one more aspect we'll share about kind of getting to that is the place and the history and the participants. So this map that you've got here, it gives you an idea of where the participants in the study were coming from. Of course, the Ojibwe world is very large and extends much beyond these areas, but the folks that were involved with this project are from these particular locations. So the focal elder, Joe, who's a respected bilingual first speaker, is from the Mille Lacs community, which you can see as circled by the number 6 that's circled there. And then the youth are students from a longtime Ojibwe immersion school that's based on the Lakota Ray Reservation in Wisconsin. And that appears circled as 15 on the map here.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out to Wadukarading, because this is sort of a miraculous thing that we've been able to do only because of the efforts of the community and so many people to make proficient speakers from that school. So now we have children who can carry on a conversation with an elder. And all of our participant elders said this is the first time they had done that. They were blown away. So it was, I mean, it's really like, I just want to say that's enough to be able to do this. What they've done is huge. Okay, so the first episode, now I've got to find my notes. What do I want to say about this? This was an episode with Money Dude and Bejigo and Joe. They had just started walking in the woods behind the college on a trail, and they came on something that we call a feather pole. And you'll notice that the children direct the attention. Joe always follows their interests. You might also notice, you might want to look at, as James said, the interaction between themselves and the feather pole. And you might want to notice too, towards the end, Joe repeats a question and asks it. I'm going to show you first this. It's a little hard to follow because there's 3 points of view going on, and it's an Ojibwe. So I'm going to just give you like a little longer trailer here. So you'll see, you know, Money Dude says, oh, you know, this is where we put out Asema. And then he releases the pole and they look up. Beige looks at it. Oh, why would Asema be put out here? Joe asks once. This is the same thing, but in a pictures view. And this gives you just a glimpse of some of how he did the analysis. Here's the rest of it. So he asked why would tobacco be put out? And then later on, they say what? And then he asks again, why would be tobacco be put out? And he uses a gesture to emphasize it. So he's trying to get this question answered. And the boys look back at him and they say, oh, I think I left some out. So first Money Dude speaks from experience and says, this is where I put it out. And then Joe keeps sort of nudging at him. He wants to get to the why. And finally, oops, before we show it, now that my thing's in the way. Oh, I guess I didn't get all I'm sorry. I didn't get all the transcript in here. But finally, Money Dude gets his question and says, oh, we put it out to tell the spirits, it's here to the bottom, to tell the spirits that the Anishinaabe are still here. So it took Joe a few tries to make this collaborative interaction. So you might want to look for that now.
Me guys nagok ga atuyang Asema.
Oh.
Oma.
Oh, mina ba senda Asema?
Gigi.
Oh.
Ga abaji og. Ga abaji og.
Anis Asema dia sangi.
Ani?
Anis ma dia sang Asema.
Oma.
Aninda.
Da winna moag Money Dude. Gabe Anishinaabe Omanam. My yaya.
So short, but pretty interesting to us because One thing I already pointed out is that youth are in the lead, and this is a sort of a traditional way in the oral traditions. The onus is on the learner to initiate the questions, to initiate the interest. Joe coordinates multiple semiotic resources to create shared meaning making and arrive at this interactional accomplishment. The things that they're mainly talking about, the tobacco, the feather pole, the act of putting out tobacco itself, bindakujige, are never referred to directly. None of those words are used, Asema is used, but the other ones are not. So the action is mediated by place, bodies, gaze, and ideas are indexed and compacted. The other point we like in this one is what I referred to earlier, that Manidood is answering from his experience. He says, he answers Joe's question, why did you put out Asema? And Manidood said, here. So he obviously had done this at some point. He put Asema out there. And Joe's like, no, why? And so Joe broadens it to a metaphysical relational understanding, to a traditional understanding. But the action is interesting because it mediates both past, what Manidood did, and he's talking from experience, the present and the futures simultaneously. So that's a reference to Deloria and Wildcat and how time and space are different in Indigenous epistemologies. So Joe's pedagogical strategies, how is land brought in as the teacher? He redirects the questions of the youth to the land. He allows silence and wondering. He supports the youth's interest. He uses stories and he uses land. What are the implications for designing language learning or revitalization? It's not just semantic and based in structural analysis, but in a sense. So in these senses, it creates an important context for communication, for intergenerational meaning making. And the context is maybe the biggest facilitator of the meaning making. Okay, so then we go on a little bit about this. It supports everyday encounters with land. It's storytelling on Ojibwe homelands and renewing relationships to land and each other. At the same time, it's revitalizing language. Could everyday interactions between a speaker and apprentice move to be more about a speaker promoting interactions than necessarily long utterances? So the other interesting thing that we found throughout is the use of dictics, and that so much is implied and compacted when you're on the spot in the context and you use your body in language. And these are things that are not maybe normally taught when we're so concerned with learning new vocabulary, or we're learning verb paradigms, or all of those things. And yet you could do a lot of communication with just dictics. Okay, I think it's your turn, James.
Yeah, so just briefly before we play this video, what I'd like you to do in this video, you're going to see, or this episode, you're going to see Joe walking with two girls from the school. And as you watch the video, he's going to be telling a story. So try to, of course, a lot of it's all in Ojibwe, and I'm sorry, we don't have the transcript for this one, but just really try to, what I'd ask you to do is observe who's talking and how. Does one person guide the focus of talk? Does something else guide the talk? How do the participants react to each other in the interaction that's taking place? And so with that, I'll go ahead and Fong, if you could start the video.
Okay, this is the next one, yeah.
The window walk within you, Mrs. Saga Gunning. I believe with the Namanji the guy was the walk when he had once at the working to a balloon here to the Kalamadi. Gawin and the Snabe, the Kalamadi, my public school, the shower. The here once again, the equation was good. I should Shaya and Chuka and Nunagua. With a shooting you, we would answer the Kagano Nag, Je gooit je maakt dus een zin. Hè? You know?
No, go basic.
Basic als zin.
Basic.
Als zin.
Sinning.
Je kent hem aan als zin.
Ooh, Lewas.
Oh, wigwa.
Whoa.
Aan de naam, dit kan ik je wigwa. Zo, wat?
Ma. Ninja niche cake. Niche, I eat.
Je gooit je maakt je we aanstaan. Je kent hem aan wat je doet hem. Anen, je kent aan aan down anen. Die winter bewaakt dus. Je weet, ik weet niet meer wat je doet hem. Waarom dus de winter bewaakt? Je zegt je weet aan de. Je know wat we maar. If you win the Bobby because we the Mogwa. Honestly, it's a good word and you do them by Yan. The Saga can get on a ma. I'll get to them, you know, I get the game. The key we don't go, my ingan being you get it out, you be guys with the new working you. Lagi yananda we when the diwag. The one guy nikadegi o scouts. Scouts ki yaw being yo.
Bobby Guinean.
Ugane?
Bobby Guinean.
Oh.
Basic Bobby Guinean. Get Baba Guinean.
Oh yeah. Umana ya bagay be.
Get Israel.
Oh.
Rendani Namaji Gingin.
Huh? You know when I'm going?
Namaji Gingin.
Oh. You used to kick up with the game, isn't Libo?
Yeah. No.
Since the backward?
Ingit inina nanen gemago medaswa
Oh.
atubanan.
We next win the news, Nikadegi.
Bitte?
Oh.
All right, so so I realize that was a lot of Ojibwe for folks that aren't maybe familiar with Ojibwe, but just to give you kind of a basic idea, and I'd asked you to really think about like the attention, right? And who's talking and how they're talking and what happens. So as Joe's walking, as they're walking together, he's telling a story. He starts out by telling a story about when he had taught about clans, about Ojibwe clans to some boys at a school. And really he continues this story throughout the episode. But what we see in this is multiple times throughout, as he's telling this story, the girls jump in and they share something about what they're seeing, what they're taking in. This might be what people would say is a little bit unlike what you might often see described as observed in traditional storytelling settings. That can be a little bit more formal, maybe, in which it's common, oftentimes, commonly thought at least, that those who are receiving a story would really just be listening to the story. In other words, those types of jumping in and noticing these different things and redirection might not happen in those kinds of settings. It's really in a more interactive kind of a dynamic that's taking place where we see, as a group of researchers, we see what happens when the girls are speaking up as reading the land, as initiated by the youth, and from his actions, the way that attention is redirected, Joe is really showing his support for this way of interaction and meaning making that's taking place between himself and the children and the land as they're going along. So it's interesting because this doesn't deter from the story either, right? If you noticed, and as you could follow the way, the kind of, at least even the cadence of his telling it, he goes back to the story. He makes the space and encourages this in the interaction as the children are bringing something up, talking about something to do with land. But then as they move on, he continues the story again. So we call this toggling between the story and reading the land, and that this takes place pretty smoothly, which we think can say a lot about how land is recognized for its agency in interactions and how language is used on and with the land.
That's right. And there's other research that supports the simultaneous attention, if you want to call it that, being simultaneously doing more than one thing when you are moving.
So a few kind of wonderings, discussion again, similar to the other slide that we have about this episode. Although he's a respected elder, Joe's role while he's on the land, walking it with the youth, is not limited to one-way storyteller and kind of controller of the attention. He actually plays a number of different roles, right? Going beyond that of storyteller. So he's redirecting questions to the youth and to the land. He's creating opportunities for knowledge development through silences and questions that can really inspire wonder within his younger interactors there. He shows support for and is willing to really share the mic, right? For the interests that the youths have when they have something that they want to bring up, they want to address, really based on what they're engaging with and what land is providing for them. He does use story, but it's also woven in between each of the other interactions, these smaller interactions that are taking place. And what's interesting, if you think about it in this way, is he's privileging the land. He's not saying, oh, that's not important, put that flower away, or, oh, we don't need to worry about that. He's showing the importance of it as something that could gain attention and that could guide conversation and or language and knowledge development as a focal input for guiding them. All of these roles lead to the sense that he's modeling and providing mentorship for the youth to participate in relational ways of being and learning with the land.
Right. Think how much times teachers would say if they didn't have to redirect attention constantly, listen to me, put that down, don't look at that, listen to me. This is a very different model of teaching and learning. Okay, Wayne Bougier's chair. We're not going to show this movie. I'm going to show you a little bit of the analysis. So this is from the same clip you just saw. Just in a few minutes down the road, they noticed this Bia says, we should find a tree that looks like this. She uses her body to mimic the tree, right? That's a sort of substrate. She extends her arm and everyone glances at the land. Land gets a turn. And B says, Mani do ginabadabi. A spirit sat there. And so then Lexi tries to find a tree. Oh, Wayne Bougier's sitting there. And then they smile and it's lighthearted. And they point in the same direction. Look there. And they look at the land. Okay, now this happens. Gonna Wabam Minung watching us. It almost looks like, oh yeah. Okay. And then they want to know who told them the story. So I'm going to go back now to the slides. And the last part of that, so that was about at minute 5. At minute 20, it comes back again. So within the story, Joe's telling about the clans, which is a Debajamoan. It's a story about a life experience. There's a reference to an Adazukan, which are our traditional wintertime stories, when to say, oh, that's Wayne Bougier's chair. So they don't tell the story because it's springtime, but they frame that story within this other story. And it comes up at the end of the walk, and Lexi says, oh, there's a chair. And then they sort of joke lightheartedly about it. And Joe says, Waynabuju's watching us. And Bia says, be careful with me. And then they all laugh. So what's going on here? So here's another kind of story. Atazukan are really different stories and treated with a lot of protocols and ceremony rather than these Debajamoan. But it's also not a story that's told at this time of year in the spring when they're walking. It's just sort of a reference. And it's a collaborative reference that they draw on to create intergenerational talk with the forest. And it's triggered by what they saw about a tree going like this. So that would only happen on land through the movement, spontaneous. And it's also sort of a reference, but used in a lighthearted way for a serious teaching, right? So there's, again, this metaphysical level comes in, just like in the Asema episode, where, yes, to tell the spirits that we're still here. And what they're saying now is, oh, the spirits are watching us all the time. Yep. So that's very interesting that all comes out of, sort of a light. It's not, like sit down and get this teaching and listen to the story. It comes out spontaneously.
So a few more wonderings that we have, and what I'll say probably doesn't match exactly with what's on the slide here, which is similar to previous one. But what this really makes us think about is, what is the nature and purpose of language when looked at from indigenous ontologies? How is language development related to those relational aspects that we're talking about of learning on land? In other words, in what ways does being on land affect the way that indigenous youth think? And how does it affect how they use and even feel language, right? We don't talk a lot about how we feel language. So how does the role of an elder who carries indigenous ontologies and knowledges facilitate language and knowledge development, specifically when on land, in ways that are different than we might typically see maybe in a school? And this may have much to do with indigenous epistemologies that do not limit knowledge and skill construction to the idea of subjects and acts, but rather connect all learning and growth and development to the living natural world of which we are all a part. So those are just some last wonderings I'll share on that one.
Howsa, Mina Umanik?
I think,
it?
the next one is just I believe my final reflections. Yeah. So I think this is the last slide, and I'll just share, again, I want to express my appreciation for this opportunity to Carla and to Wabishki Miigwan and to the team that worked on this. So really, in reflecting on my experience as a research assistant on this study, a whole lot of things come to mind, and I narrowed this way down as much as I could. But first, it expanded the ways through which I could see multiple interrelated aspects of holistic indigenous language pedagogy and development, especially considering aspects of intergenerational language and language in relation to land, the unique and important roles that learning in this way can play in indigenous language revitalization and reclamation, being that that's a huge focus of mine. I was able to better see language development, use, and intergenerational interaction from multiple angles, right? In this kind of from multimodality, not limiting focus on language development to classroom-based oral and written communication. And in this way, it's like, for me, it really connects back to this idea of revernacularization, which is a term that's used sometimes in language revitalization reclamation, and conceptualizing that idea, revernacularization, in a way that's not just among human beings, but also among all beings with whom we interact. That's a different way of looking at it. This project helps us to consider language development from indigenous ontology and worldview that really emphasizes the idea of relationality, or more specifically, relationality to land as a relative and as a teacher in knowledge and skill development and cultivation. It highlighted for me the importance of including more focus on, on intergenerational interaction, mentoring, and teaching in indigenous language teaching and learning, because they're not happening enough right now in Indigenous communities to maintain and revitalize our languages and knowledges for future generations, which I think I see this also as a huge opportunity, right? To do more with elders and youth to connect these things when it comes to the documentation that's taking place. So the study also gives us insights for the way we can conceptualize documentation and its role. It highlights opportunities for documentation, as Fong was talking about earlier, when she said she had seen and interacted with Rhodes, to think about documentation and its purpose. What would happen if more work of this kind were being done to document these types of real life interactions outside of institutional or formal program settings for language cultivation as guided by Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies? How can we document, how can this type of documentation teach us more about what we want to do with language revitalization and reclamation? So recognizing this possible, I guess, the way it could impact the way the work that we do, projects like this, has really inspired me to think about ways that I could apply this to the intergenerational interaction and language knowledge cultivation. And finally, all of these insights, I believe, as someone who's focused on language development, language teaching and learning, the cultivation of language and knowledge in Indigenous ways, really all these insights and ideas really lend to future work that points to significant implications, for development of the net and other Indigenous immersion education, from standards and curriculum to pedagogy, to teacher training and locations and formats for schools. Really, the insights from this project can contribute a great deal to kind of reframing our ideas of language development as one interrelated aspect of the holistic positive growth and development of Indigenous youth. So sorry that was a bit wordy, but there's a lot of thoughts going on here when it comes to how this project has helped me to think about things differently. So with that, I think I'll just say ahehe. I don't know, Fong, if you have more to share.
Is there any more slides? Oh, I just have, become very radical in my old age and COVID and thinking so much about land and language, and it's really changed me too. It's lovely to hear the ways that it's inspired you, James. I really kind of got a deeper level of land evolving, language evolving with land, as growing things, as growings that have been intertwined. And it's really makes me wonder how, that's like a way to decolonize this concept of language. I mean, I think the very concept of language is very colonial a lot of times, the way it's shorthand. And I also want to say that in terms of Indigenous teaching and learning, it also has made me think, why do we ever do that inside? Why do we ever do it? Why do we ever do it where we're age segregated? But of course, these are just the Indigenous future imaginings. And I'm still grounded here and happy to work with the schools, but it's good to imagine too what a futures could be. Meet you.
Well, thanks, James and Mary. I really appreciated, especially the final thoughts. They were very inspirational. And I'm sure there's going to be a robust discussion. There's been a lot of activity in the chat. There is one question in the chat from Mila, and they ask, would you think when giving offerings to the ancestors, we would rather teach by doing and then explain later? So I don't know, Mila, if you want to elaborate on that question, you can unmute yourself to do that.
Good morning. I'm a language teacher from the Albuquerque Public Schools, and I was just, when we saw the video about the tobacco, our young people learned to give offerings to the ancestors by giving cornmeal to the father son, at different times of the year and in the mornings. And usually, for example, our kids know how to do that without being told to do it. So it's learning by example, and of course we learned that as young people. If we have somebody, in the family to teach that. So that's why I made that remark. But, everyone does things differently, and following cultural protocols, and that is always intertwined with language learning. So that's just a comment I saw.
Yeah, miigwech mila. Thank you for your work out there in Albuquerque. Woo! That is, I think, the way we teach those things too. And if you noticed in the video, they were not actually putting out tobacco, and they knew they were filming. So I think that's interesting too. Those things we do not film, we actually do them, and that's where the real learning is in that way. But it's almost like Joe wanted to share that. He wanted, and he knew that they knew why they did it, but he wanted to bring it out. And I thought that was very generous of him to share that, actually.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another comment in the chat that maybe you two want to comment on. It's from Sam, and he says, such cool data. I was struck with the way the two girls verbally acknowledged Joe's switch into English as well. So this was the second video that you showed when he said the word public school. Also with the way attention seems to rarely be on the bodies or faces of the speakers. Is that something that was striking to the two of you when you were analyzing your data?
I mean, they're walking. So it was striking when they would look at each other, when they would stop and look at each other. Like there's one moment in the Asema video where Money Dude looks directly at Joe. And that is the rarity, right? Because he doesn't get the question, and now Joe's asked him 3 times. And so then he's like, huh? And Anin? And he looks. So that's pretty striking. It happens in some of the other videos, like the Wagagan video, where he's asking Joe, is this really a Wagagan? And he looks between Joe and the Wagagan. So, I mean, it sort of focuses when they do look at each other or they all look at the land. It's very interesting because it's usually some sort of collaborative moment, right? A deeper meaning making that's going on.
Yeah, and I would also say that thinking about it in terms of like a setting for learning, I think what that speaks to is that it's almost as if it's an assumption in the way that they're going into this experience together, that there is going to be learning that takes place, there is going to be interaction that takes place along the way, and it's out there with everything that's provided, that's surrounding us, with all the relatives that are there, and as if like that is not the classroom, but the learning inputs that will be there, and that it's expected. And so people are, they're going, that's of course where the attention would be to all the many relatives that are there through the land, represented through the land. So I think that says a lot about this kind of way of having interaction or teaching and learning.
So there's another comment from Tracy that maybe the two of you can speak to, and they say, I'm very interested in the mentoring aspect between age and skill level groups. This is also something that happens in the language that I teach. So I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more just about the mentoring that happens between elders and youth. I'm assuming that that's what Tracy's commenting on.
Or is it the peer-to-peer?
Potentially. Tracy, do you want to unmute and elaborate? There's no requirement to do so, but.
I just found it very interesting. I teach Japanese, and there's also a difference, like the way older will talk to younger. There's that senpai-kohai relationship. People who have different skill levels in the way they talk with others and sharing knowledge. So I found it very interesting, the way the elders were talking to the young children. And it's something I see also when I'm looking at Japanese interactions between the elderly and the young.
Yeah. Thank you, Tracy. And it's, there's still different registers depending on the context, right? So to have such a informal context, I think is really important. In one of her recent pieces, Barbara Meek writes about how, because elders have such status and language has such status, that it's often very hard and kind of creates these barriers between the intergenerational informal talk, which is exactly what we need and want. So I think, I think the walking and being outside was really helpful. I think if they had been in a classroom, the interactions would have been completely different.
I also appreciated your discussion about landscape and language. It's also something that I find in Japanese referring to the language or to the landscape around them. So you've inspired me to rewrite another lesson about land words and Japanese. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you for that. I think everyone should dig into the land and figure out if how the language they're using is connected to the place they're inhabiting. Then you're like, oh, we're all speaking a foreign language.
So we've got a question from Martha, and she asks, I'd love to hear more about cultural protocols and how they fit with these videos, or just more generally.
Cultural protocols. That's a big topic.
Yeah, do you mean
there's, go ahead.
I was just going to say, is that in reference to like conducting research, or in terms of learning situations?
Actually, it was one of your respondents who had mentioned it, the person from New Mexico, I believe, who commented earlier and mentioned cultural protocols. So it sort of sparked my interest suddenly on that topic. So whichever way you would like to interpret it, I'd just love to hear more about that, because I'm sure they differ from our monolingual protocols of English. And so if you could comment, I'd love to hear more.
I could say a couple of things that come to mind. Like, one of the protocols we didn't talk about very much is around the Adazukan, or the traditional stories. I mean, James alluded to it, but it's very strict that you never interrupt an elder during a Adazukan, during a traditional story. It's unheard of. So this example was very interesting, how they used the story and took it up in less formal ways. The protocols in research, for example, I gave tobacco to all the participants to ask them to be in the project, and they put tobacco out before we started. And it was known that none of that would be filmed, or none of that would be actually included in the research. So there's always things, and to me, the lines in research are, we don't record wintertime stories. We don't record anything that has to do with ceremony or spirits. They talk about spirits in this, but they're not ceremonies. So yeah, that's some of the protocols.
I would also add, just from another perspective, not necessarily reflecting specifically on this data in this project, but just thinking about cultural protocol when it comes to language, and how we, again, like I said, thinking about the nature and the purpose of language, and Indigenous ontology. When I think about the way that we use language and the way that we use it in interaction with land, that in and of itself could be considered cultural protocol, depending on how we're defining cultural protocol. So there's the physical act of maybe making an offering of whatever kind from whatever region you are, and those types of things. But it just as the comment came there. But at the same time, there's also, when you think about seeing the world through a certain set of lenses and relating to something like a tree, like a plant, in a truly relational way, and interacting with that being, the language that you use, establishing that connection, that in of itself is a cultural protocol in a sense. Some people might say, and different Indigenous folks have different ways of seeing it in the language they use. But I can say from my people and our way of looking at things, I would look at that as a cultural protocol. In other words, I don't just go up and say that's a tree or there's a tree. There's a way of interacting with it that establishes that connection, and that is cultural protocol as well. So there's a lot of layers to that and a lot of nuance within it, depending, and it's specific to each individual group too, I think, which is
Right.
beautiful. It's awesome.
Yep. And the oral protocols of the traditional teaching protocols, where the young people are sort of initiating the action, that's also a protocol. And it's striking to me. Like, I've been on walks, you go on these walks in the national parks or something, and you get a guide, and they're very much directed by the expert person, right? And they have to do a lot with like telling the names or things like that. And so, this was very different in the co-constructing. And I think that is very cultural.
So there's another question from Amber, who writes, do you think literal translations of Indigenous languages could help neurotypical connect more to the lands? I'm not sure. I don't know. Amber, do you want to elaborate on that question?
Sorry, trying to. So I found that a lot of neurodiverse or people on the autism spectrum have a lot of Native ancestry. And so I was thinking of a way. I've been working with the city to kind of, how do we teach the neurotypical or the colonizers to connect to the land so they're not doing as much damage. And when I share, like from the Seneca language, that like the literal translation for love is, you are a great medicine for me, it changes their perceptions of those words and helps them really connect with the lands. So I'm wondering, if doing those literal translations will help build those bridges, and just kind of the difference between the neurotypical and neurodivergent. And is that something that's emerging more in the field?
That's a really deep and interesting question, Amber. I don't know. I mean, I think thinking in pictures for one thing, right? And I don't know that much about spectrum, but thinking in pictures, and our language is very descriptive, and the morphemes tend to create pictures and descriptions. I think that's a nice connection. Sometimes literal translations, as you know, in English, get sort of weirdly appropriated. So there's that. So I don't know, James, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it actually, for me, it goes back, there's two things. One, it goes back to the idea that I was sharing earlier about feeling of connection to language. And language is a way of feeling connection to other things, also to any other beings. And so when we look at language in that way, and when we think about like makade mashkiki wavu, one of my favorite words in Ojibwe that I've learned from those who have taught me some Ojibwe, including Wabishki Miwan. When you think about what the meaning of that, if I just say that, it just sounds like, okay, I associate that with coffee. But if I think about breaking it down into the different parts and what it actually means, that helps me to feel it and connect with it more in a different way. The same is of any other thing that's out there in nature that we may interact with. It's not just a name devoid of meaning. It's about that meaning making, and that meaning making being tied to feeling. And if we all can experience that a little bit more, not just, and I'll take this another level, which is not just Indigenous folks. I'm focused on my own language and on Indigenous languages as a start, but really this is our ontologies and our epistemologies say these teachings are for everyone. So what would it be like if all schools, I'm not trying to like change all schools across the United States right this moment, but what would it be if all schools did a little bit more of some of this stuff in terms of relating to the place that we're living in terms of relating to the place we might be grounded, and how that affects our whole lives going up into old age and completing a whole life cycle. All of those things go down to the tiniest little micro interaction of when you're addressing some plant or tree or animal or other living thing, even to like a mountain or a river or things like that. It can. That's indigenous ontology oftentimes and epistemologies. And so if we can make that possible, I can't see why that wouldn't help other folks, regardless if they're, you know, if they are autistic or not, but hopefully it would also.
And I think, Amber, your question was if it would help neurotypical people to make a connection. And that's really interesting because more and more, I think that is the way we have to go. We have to get all of the human race to feel more connected to the planet. And so I do think people should learn the indigenous language of the place that they are occupying or settling or living in.
Well, I think that's a great way to conclude, Mary. So thank you for that comment. And I want to thank Mary and James for this really lovely presentation. I always feel calm for some reason after you talk about this research, and thinking about connecting to the land like that, I think is really beautiful. So thank you so much. I know we didn't get to everybody's questions, but if the two of you want to engage with speakers via email to answer these questions, one's from Jenna, whom you know, and there's another from Lisa. So anyway, I want to thank all of you for coming today and for your time and for choosing to come to a Carla talk. We really appreciate it. And we hope that we will see you here in the future as we continue to present talks over the course of this semester. So thank you again to all, and have a great day.
Miigwech bijag.